Driebelbis Cave Heart Attack Tragedy. On October 1st, 1983, 6 friends entered a limestone cave called Driebelbis Cave near the town of Kutztown in eastern Pennsylvania. It was late at night. They chose to go in after dark because the bats would be out of the cave at that time. One of the group was a 36-year-old man named Robert Scott from the town of Trapp, near Philadelphia. Robert was not an experienced caver. He also suffered from epilepsy. About 75 feet from the entrance, the group reached a narrow vertical crevice in the rock. The crevice was about 80 feet high, but only 12 inches wide at the top. In the middle, it squeezed down to just 7 or 8 inches, barely wider than a human head. The walls were rounded and covered in slippery mud. Robert's friends squeezed through the narrow section on their feet without problems, but Robert decided to crawl through instead. Halfway through the tightest part, his hand slipped on the wet rock. His body dropped down into the narrowest section of the crevice. He was instantly wedged tight, left side down, unable to move in any direction. The walls pressed hard against his chest from both sides. He could barely breathe. His friends tried to pull him free for 8 straight hours, but the rock was too smooth and too slippery. There was nothing to grip. Every time they pulled, Robert's body would not budge. At 9:30 in the morning, the group went for outside help. Volunteers from 4 fire departments arrived first. Then 14 trained cave rescue specialists were flown in from Pittsburgh. Rescuers could reach Robert from above and below the crevice. They could touch him, talk to him, and even feed him. They gave him medicine to control his seizures, and they fed him coffee and hot dogs through the gap in the rock. But they could not pull him out. The rock was too tight and too slippery to get any leverage. Robert began to panic. He screamed and thrashed, which only wedged him deeper into the crevice. Rescuers tried to calm him down, but his fear was overwhelming. Hour after hour, Robert's body temperature dropped in the cold, damp rock. The pressure on his chest made every breath harder than the last. He had been trapped for 29 hours. Then, at about 7 in the morning on Monday, without warning, Robert went silent. His pulse disappeared. His blood pressure dropped to nothing. The rescuers pumped oxygen into the crevice and tried to revive him, but it was too late. Robert Scott had suffered a massive heart attack. The autopsy showed the cause of death was congestive heart failure due to irreversible shock. The shock was caused by cold, fear, and the constant pressure on his chest from the rock. Once Robert was dead, rescuers used painful methods they had avoided while he was alive, dragging his body upward with ropes and slings. It took 5 more hours to pull him out of the crevice. He was removed from the cave at 12:35 in the afternoon. The coroner and rescue coordinator both called for the cave to be permanently sealed. Robert Scott died 75 feet from the entrance, in a spot where rescuers could touch his face but could not save his life. Gouffre de Corbeaux Heart Attack Body Recovery. In September 2011, a team of 5 French cavers began a 3-day expedition into a deep cave system in the Pyrenees Mountains on the border between France and Spain. The cave was called Gouffre de Corbeaux, the Pit of the Crows. It dropped over 700 meters below the surface through a series of vertical shafts, narrow tunnels, and underground rivers. Reaching the bottom took a full day of climbing, crawling, and swimming. The expedition leader was a 58-year-old man named Michel. Michel had been caving since he was 17 years old. He had explored some of the deepest caves in Europe. He was fit for his age, lean, strong, and still faster on a rope than most younger cavers. But Michel had a secret he kept from his team. 6 months earlier, his doctor had found an irregular heartbeat during a routine checkup. The doctor told him to avoid extreme physical stress. Michel ignored the warning. He believed his body knew its limits better than any doctor. The team descended through the first day without problems, setting up camp at a depth of 500 meters on a dried ledge above an underground river. That night, Michel complained of feeling tired but blamed it on the long descent. He ate dinner with the group and went to sleep in his bivouac sack. At 3 in the morning, one of the team members woke up to a strange sound. Michel was making short, shallow gasps. His body was shaking. By the time the team member reached him with a headlamp, Michel had stopped breathing. The team tried CPR for over 30 minutes in the freezing cave, taking turns pressing on his chest in a space barely wide enough to kneel. It was no use. Michel was dead. He had suffered a cardiac arrest in his sleep, 500 meters below the surface of the earth. The 4 surviving team members now faced a terrible decision. They could not carry Michel's body out of the cave. The route to the surface involved climbing hundreds of meters of vertical rope, squeezing through passages barely wide enough for a living person, and crossing an underground river. Carrying a dead man through all of that was physically impossible for 4 exhausted cavers. They wrapped Michel's body in his bivouac sack, placed his helmet and headlamp on his chest, and marked the spot with a small cairn of rocks. Then they began the long, silent climb to the surface. It took them 14 hours to reach daylight. A professional body recovery team entered the cave 3 weeks later. It took 40 specialist rescuers 6 days to bring Michael's body to the surface. They had to rig new ropes, install pulleys on every vertical shaft, and build a system of counterweights to haul the stretcher up the narrowest sections. Michael's wife told reporters that she had begged him not to go on the expedition. She said he had smiled and told her he would rather die in a cave than in a hospital bed. He got his wish. Michel's doctor said that at 500 meters deep, with freezing temperatures, thin air, and extreme physical effort, his heart never stood a chance. The cave did not kill Michel, his own pride did. Blue Mountain Pit Cave Heart Attack Rescue. In the summer of 2009, a 61-year-old retired schoolteacher named Frank joined a group of experienced cavers for a trip into a deep pit cave in the mountains of northern Alabama. Frank had been caving for over 30 years. He was one of the most experienced members of his local caving club, but he was also the oldest. The cave they were exploring required a 120-foot rappel down a vertical shaft just to reach the main passage. Frank had done this kind of descent hundreds of times. He clipped into the rope, leaned back over the edge, and dropped smoothly into the darkness below. At the bottom, the cave opened into a network of muddy tunnels and tight crawlways. The group spent 3 hours exploring, mapping a new side passage and photographing unusual formations. Then it was time to leave. Leaving meant climbing back up the 120-foot rope, a brutal physical effort that took most cavers 20 to 30 minutes of nonstop exertion. Frank clipped his ascenders onto the rope and began pulling himself upward. For the first 40 feet, he moved steadily. Then he started to slow down. His breathing became ragged and loud, echoing off the walls of the shaft. At about 60 feet and halfway up, Frank stopped moving. He hung on the rope in the middle of the shaft, gasping for air. His chest felt like it was being crushed from the inside. His left arm tingled and went weak. He tried to call down to his friends, but his voice came out as a whisper. The caver waiting at the bottom of the rope saw Frank's headlamp stop moving and shouted up to him. Frank did not respond. He was having a heart attack, suspended on a rope 60 feet above the cave floor and 60 feet below the surface. The group radioed for help from the cave entrance. A rescue team arrived within 2 hours. But getting to Frank was the problem. He was hanging in the middle of a vertical shaft with no ledge, no platform, and no way to lay him down. A rescuer rappelled down from above and reached Frank on the rope. Frank was conscious, but barely moving. His skin was gray and cold, and his pulse was weak and irregular. The rescuer attached a second rope to Frank's harness and, with help from the team above, slowly hauled him up the remaining 60 feet to the top of the shaft. It took over an hour to raise him those 60 feet. At the surface, paramedics were waiting with a stretcher and oxygen. Frank was airlifted to a hospital 40 miles away. Doctors said he had suffered a major heart attack and was lucky to be alive. If the attack had happened 10 minutes later, when he was higher on the rope and further from help, he almost certainly would have died hanging in the darkness. Frank never went caving again. He told his friends that the cave had given him 30 good years and then sent him one final message. It was time to stop. Cumberland Caverns heart attack collapse. In January 2004, a group of teenagers from a church youth program arrived at a large show cave in central Tennessee for a weekend adventure. The cave was famous for its enormous underground chambers and stunning rock formations. The group had 22 teenagers and 3 adult leaders. The oldest leader was a 54-year-old man named David. David had organized the trip. He had visited the cave once before years ago and told the kids it would be the highlight of their year. The group signed up for a guided walking tour that went deep into the cave system. The path was well lit and paved in most sections, but in some areas the tour required climbing over boulders, ducking under low ceilings, and squeezing through narrow gaps. David was a big man. He was overweight and had high blood pressure, but he had not told anyone in the group about his health problems. He did not want the kids to worry. For the first hour, everything was fine. The teenagers laughed and took photos of the huge stalactites hanging from the ceiling. David walked at the back of the group, moving slower than the others but keeping up. Then the tour reached a long, uphill section deep inside the cave. The air was cool and damp, and the climb was steeper than it looked. David started breathing heavily. His face turned red. Sweat poured down his forehead even though the cave temperature was only 12 degrees Celsius. One of the teenagers noticed and asked if he was okay. David waved them off and said he just needed a minute. He sat down on a rock ledge and tried to catch his breath. Then his left arm went numb. A crushing pain spread across his chest like a heavy weight pressing down on his ribs. David grabbed his chest and fell sideways off the ledge. The guide radioed the surface immediately. Two of the adult leaders began CPR while the teenagers stood in the dark, crying and holding each other. A medical team from the surface rushed into the cave with a defibrillator and emergency supplies. They reached David in about 40 minutes. They shocked his heart 3 times. But David never regained consciousness. He was pronounced dead deep inside the cave, surrounded by the children he had brought there to have the time of their lives. The teenagers had to walk past David's body on their way out of the cave. Some of them never went underground again. David's wife later said he had been warned by his doctor not to do anything physically demanding. But he loved those kids and did not want to let them down. His heart gave out trying to keep up with them in the dark.